Hello, welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to talk about a feature that I've hardly used on this Sony A7R4 of mine. I thought I'd use it a lot. I haven't actually got around to using it much, but in this video we're going to actually explore this feature. The feature in question is the high resolution mode that it offers. Basically, it uses sensor shifting technology, the stabilizing mechanism, to move the sensor tiny fractions, pixels at a time, in a rectangular or square pattern, so that it can take the same image but in multiple places, or it takes 4 images or 16 images, depending which mode I've got it set to, and then out of camera, which is a shame because other manufacturers seem to manage to be able to do this in camera, but out of camera I have to run those into a piece of software that Sony provide that overlay them all together. Now, the first of the two modes that it's got is the 4-image mode, and that doesn't produce a bigger image. It produces still a 60 megapixel image, I believe. But what it's doing is it's actually capturing red, green and blue at each of the pixel positions, rather than just each one having its own colour designation because of the Bayer pattern that's on the filter in front of the sensor. And consequently you get much cleaner images as a result of that. Both of these modes do suffer from the problem that they can't handle very well any movement or motion in the picture, so it only works on static things, well, landscapes where there aren't trees moving or there isn't water moving, that sort of thing. But the second mode is where it takes 16 images. So it's actually producing a 240 megapixel image, of which each pixel has got full colour at each point, rather than just being a single colour interpreted. So I'm going to have a play with it. I'm going to set it up on a tripod. I'm going to point it out into the garden at some static objects and see what the images look like. Okay, I've taken the shots and I've got the camera ready. I'm going to pull the images off the SD card and load them into Sony's proprietary software, and then I'll switch across to a screencast with you guys and I'll show you what the images look like, and I'll voice that over so that we can talk it through and see if it works or not. Okay, here we are in Lightroom. I've got a series of images at the bottom. There are the images that I took, which were for the purposes of seeing the high resolution mode working earlier, and I focused in on this series of shots here. There are 4 60 megapixel files here. The software produces that. I don't get a say in that. I don't even know why it produces 4 60 megapixel merged files, but it does. But the 240 megapixel file, which is this one, I'll show you in a second, but let me just pick one of the 60 megapixel files. Bear in mind these should have no noise because these have had full color at every pixel, which is why they're still 60 megapixels. It's one of the modes that it does. It's mode 1, I think it is. Anyway, if I zoom in on this terracotta pot here, you can see 60 megapixels gives me an awful lot of detail. The tiny crack and the tiny little bits of production, sort of where the pot was turned, these lines around the edge here are very, very impressive, very stunning, very clear, and across the image you can see virtually no noise at all. And if I boost the highlights or boost the exposure, you can see the shadows just come out completely clean. So that's quite an impressive thing in its own right. Now, this is a 1-to-1 zoom in, so you can see the pot more or less fills the frame on Lightroom here. Top bottom of the pot just above the bottom here, and the top of the pot just slightly below the top of the frame. And there's also in the picture here a tiny crack and a tiny piece of moss growing. Hardly tell that's a piece of moss, but it is a little bit of moss clinging onto the side of the pot. Now what I'm going to do is go across to the 240 megapixel image here, which is this one, and interestingly the image is a lot darker. I don't really know why. I'll try and boost it a bit so that it looks more comparable with the previous image, but when I click the auto setting, it looks also more colourful, a little worryingly too colourful for my liking. I think I'm tempted to take the colour down a bit, so that it's again a bit closer to what the 60 megapixel file produced. Anyway, I'll do what I did with the other picture, and that is zoom in on this pot here in the bottom. Now notice the first thing is the pot now completely fills the frame because it's 4 times bigger. So instead of it sort of appearing there at the top and appearing there at the bottom, the whole thing is bigger. So this is a 1:1 pixel representation of a 240 megapixel file with full color at all of the positions, all of the pixels. And we can now see that from the previous frame, this crack here area and this piece of moss are now much more detailed. You can actually see the individual pieces of the moss, whatever they're called, tiny little fronds, I guess they are. I don't know if they're leaves, but whatever they are, you can see them. And that gives you a clear indication of what 240 megapixels actually does. And what this also shows, I've just noticed it here, is this area here. You can see there's a tiny sort of checker pattern appearing in it. That's because when it has any movement, and these tiny little bits of plant here have probably been moving because the wind's quite ferocious. And you can see here as well, that series of leaves, or the 16 images that were taken that generated this final output, has had problems with dealing with this merging images together because of the movement, and as tiny a movement as it needs to be is only 1 pixel shift. It moves it 16 times, then you can see it's just having trouble dealing with that. That is typical of what happens when there is motion. They'll probably be able to see more of it. There's some slight bit here on this water because there's probably splashes happening, and there's some there as well. It's quite difficult to see it, and it probably might not even show up on this screencast when it ends up on YouTube, but it is there, and I might take a couple of expanded views of this and just link them in at the end so that it's possible to see it a bit easier. But that, I think, is a clear hands down win for high resolution mode. As I mentioned earlier, the artifacts that we're seeing here can be dealt with relatively easily, because if one of the 60 megapixel images here is brought into Lightroom as well as the 240 megapixel image, and then the 60 megapixel image is upsampled to match the 240 megapixels by multiplying it by 2 in each direction, then provided those 2 images line up properly, it's possible then using Photoshop to paint through the layers to expose, if for instance the high resolution image was the top image and the upsampled 60 megapixel was the underneath image, you could cut through the high resolution images in areas like this to expose the single frame image where the leaves or the foliage would have been perfectly in focus, and then you would lose this checker pattern effect that we've got. And that's a tiny compromise for the amount of accuracy you're going to get in the picture everywhere else. Again, you can see here this leaf obviously moved because it's fuzzy, whereas these didn't, because they're quite sturdy little, I'm not sure what they are, I'd have to ask Sarah. These have not moved, and therefore there's no checker patterning appearing on there. So I hope you found that interesting. Not everyone has got access to a camera that can do this, I appreciate that, but I also thought that you guys might be interested to see what it really means in practice. I'm sure there are other videos out there covering this subject. I just thought I'd put one together on a more practical day-to-day, a little bit non-scientific sort of view on exactly what it represents. The obvious downside to having this many megapixels is that you are going to use up an awful lot of disk space very quickly if you start firing off lots of these shots, because not only have you got to have space for the 16 images which are the basic for the high res picture, but you've also got the high res picture coming out at 240 megapixels, so you're eating gigabytes worth of storage away just for 2 or 3 images. So that's something to bear in mind if you go this route. I will be using it more in future, but at the moment the weather's a bit inclement and I can't really see anything that I can use it on. So there we are. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this an interesting sort of topic, probably one a little bit out of the normal. And again, thanks for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you like this input, and we'll speak to you again. Goodbye. Okay, the next two images are screen grabs of enlarged sections of Lightroom to show you what the checker patterning looks like. And with this image you can clearly see that the leaf on this plant has moved, and you can even see the different colours of the dots that it's left, each individual pixel there, green, red, yellow, blue, whatever. So that's a clear indication that motion in the images can be a problem. And the next shot as well is of what I thought were stationary pieces of plant, but they're clearly not, because you can see the same effect when zoomed in very tightly on these. Anyway, I think that just proves that we need to be careful that there's no motion in the picture, and if there is, then I have to be prepared to do the editing technique in Photoshop that I was discussing earlier in this video. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for listening. Bye.